Welcome to Somber Chronicles. All the stories are written by yours truly. This episode is called The False Lights. Sit back, enjoy the show. Camping has not always been a fun experience for me, so to speak. I've always been worried about wild animals, bugs, and, well, the weather, of course. On my last camping experience, there was a big storm that soaked all of our clothes. It's really put a damper on things, and I wouldn't be going on another camping trip for a pretty long time. It might have been forever if it weren't for a group of my college friends. They all wanted to go and spend a couple nights camping. This kind of went against my instinct, and I reluctantly went along with them. I brought a book with me because I wasn't sure what we could possibly be doing for, well, a couple nights in the woods. Along with that, I brought some clothes, bug spray, some snacks, a tent, and any other items I might be needing for the trip. By the time I left the house, I had 2 large bags that looked like they were about to burst. My friend Alex pulled up in her car, and I tossed my things in the back with the rest of everyone else's stuff. I opened one of the back doors and crawled inside. I had to push past a couple of my friends in order to get into the back seat. Everyone was pretty excited to go on the trip. I was a bit nervous, obviously, but, I had a fake smile. They were my friends after all. I just didn't want to ruin their time, especially after they were so nice and invited me. I opened my book and began to read. It was a bit of a long drive. Long stretches of houses began to disappear and become more flat land. After some time, some large trees as big as a 7-story building began to sprout out from the ground. It was at that point that I had made partway through my book and looked up. I was amazed at how big they were. I had seen big trees before, but these seemed to dwarf us in size. Alex drove until she saw a small booth with its arm down. She stopped the car and then she talked a little with the forest ranger. He nodded his head, said a couple things to her before raising the gate arm. I had put my book back in the bag and leaned on the window as we drove. The road began to curve a little and we could see parked cars in a small clearing with a bunch of other tents. I was confused when we just drove past the tents and the cars and drove further into the forest. The sky overhead was getting darker. Not because it was night or because of the clouds, it was just getting darker because of the trees. It was as if the trees were creating a net to catch all the sunlight. Soon we parked in a small clearing in the middle of nowhere. I checked my phone and we had absolutely no connection. I watched all my friends get out of the car and get their things. I followed them and we began to unpack. It took us about an hour to get everything set up. We made a fire pit with some rocks and some sticks. I was helping Jessie with her tent when she was struggling to get the pole into the right position. One of the poles snapped and slashed her hand. I rushed over to her to see if she needed any help. I was hoping that this was not a sign of things to come. After we made sure that Jessie was in no serious danger, we began to make dinner. It was on this first night of our trip that things started to get a little weird. We began to have a good time, having some drinks and cooking by the fire pit, when we began to hear something strange. It sounded like rain, but there was not a cloud in the sky. The only thing illuminating our campsite was the fire. I turned around and I could have sworn I saw a light. It was bright and orange. It seemed to flicker like a candle. I blinked and it was gone. I rubbed my eyes a little bit, but the light did not come back. I felt a hand on my shoulder and I jumped. I turned around and I saw Alex was looking at me with a look of concern. I told her I was fine. She gave me a skeptical glance and I got up from my seat and told her that I was a bit tired from waking up so early and that tomorrow I'll be feeling better. I crawled into my tent and wrapped myself in the covers. I woke up the next morning with a droplet of water hitting my cheek. I opened my eyes, concerned, and saw that there was this cut in my tent. The droplets of rainwater were leaking into my tent. I wiped my face and sat up. I looked around to see if the rest of my tent was drenched due to the small opening. Thankfully, everything was dry and I was really relieved. I looked through my bag and pulled out a roll of duct tape and sealed both sides of the hole. I looked down and saw something on the forest floor. It looked like a stretched out hoof print. My friends were starting to wake up and I walked around the campsite. There was a small cut on each one of their tents in the same spot. I could tell that it was intentional, just didn't know the reason why. I was certain that something was out there. The problem was, the campsite that we were supposed to go to was probably a mile or two away from where we were staying. My friends were obviously a little upset there was a hole in their tent where bugs can get in. I helped them patch up the spot with the tape and we went about our day. We made some breakfast by the campfire and some coffee. It did not taste great, but Alex said that it was just part of the experience of being an outdoorsman. Tom and I went fishing while Alex, Jesse, and Sarah stayed at the camp. I put my things near a log by the river and sat down. We had brought some bait with us, so we didn't have to go digging around in the dirt. I cast my line into the murky water and leaned back a little, waiting to get a bite. I tried to talk to Tom, but he was distracted by something. He began to turn pale and stared across the river deep into the forest. I tapped him on the shoulder and he jumped. His eyes were wide like a scared animal. I asked him if he was all right and he just nodded his head a little. He told me he thought he saw something in the trees. He said it looked like a person. They were small, hunched over, and looking right at them. I tried to see something in the forest that matched the description that he was giving, but I just couldn't see anything. Then I felt it. It was a tingly feeling. The feeling that you get when you feel like you're being watched. I stood up slowly and turned to Tom. I could tell that he was thinking the exact same thing I was. We need to get back to camp. We packed up our things as quickly as we could and walked back to camp. We would look behind us every couple seconds to see if we were being followed. Without reason, we just started running as fast as we could, feeling the wet, warm air fill our lungs as we made our way back to the camp. My foot almost got caught in one of the tree roots as we were running. Twisted my ankle pretty bad. We arrived at the camp out of breath. The girls were confused. Tom began to ramble about the creature that he saw at the river and looked at me as if I would confirm his story. I couldn't. I didn't see what made him so terrified. The girls were worried at first when they saw us running into the camp at full sprint. But the more they listened, the more they thought that this was some sort of prank. They were not too happy with us. They said that they were worried and thought we were attacked by a bear. Tom tried his best to convince them, but it was just no use. The girls just began to ignore him. He looked at me and lowered his head. He went into his tent and laid down. Alex was looking at me a bit concerned, and we talked for a little. Jesse and Sarah left the campsite to find more wood for the fire. Alex placed a hand on my leg and asked if I was doing all right and even apologized for Tom's rambling. I had told her about my past experience camping, so she was worried that she had somehow made things worse. I joked a little, trying to distract myself from Tom's ramblings about this small creature that was hunched over. I did manage to make Alex smile a little, showing closer and rested her head on my shoulder. I closed my eyes and could feel my heart racing a little bit. I felt the little rays of sun on my skin that were just strong enough to punch through the thick layer of tree leaves. It was peaceful, just for a moment. Then I could hear it, screaming. Jesse and Sarah came running at us at a full sprint. and it hid behind one of the fallen logs. I stood up suddenly and I could feel Alex gripping my arm as she stood up. I looked in the direction that the girls were running from and I saw nothing. Nothing. There was nothing there. Alex rushed over to Sarah and Jesse, asking them what they saw. Before they could open their mouths, it began to drizzle. I looked around worried and looked up at the sky. There had not been a cloud in the sky before now. Now the sky was pitch black. I just looked up at the sky and wondered how the trip could get any worse. Alex pulled me by my arm and she brought me into her tent. Our clothes were a bit wet and we began to shiver in the tent. Everyone shouted to each other from their tents to communicate. We came up with a plan to save the campfire so that we could warm up and dry our clothes. I rushed out with Tom and grabbed the tarp from Alex's car and tossed it over the pile of wood that we had made to make a fire pit. I rushed back into Alex's tent and now it was drenching wet. She gave me some of her cover so that I could dry off. Then I heard something. It was distant. A thumping sound was coming closer to our tent. I saw little lights slowly come into view. They began to move around our tent. They cast strange shadows of those holding the light. I could not see what they were clearly. They were hunched over and wearing long, flowing clothes. The light shined through the holes of their clothes. I thought they were wearing some sort of mask as their face poked out of their hoods. But then I saw one of them open its mouth and licked its lips. I could feel Alex holding onto my arm tighter. It began to hurt. We sat there watching the figures rub their hands over their tent, and I could see the tent bulge at points. And then one of their claws poked through. They quickly pulled away their hand and continued walking around. They did this for what felt like hours, poking at the tent, sniffing the air. Then they began to run. Sound stopped, and all that left was the rain. I waited a little bit longer in the tent before I had the courage to get out and look around. We were alone. Finally alone. It was too dangerous to stay, but it was also too dangerous to drive at night. We decided to leave first thing in the morning the next day. We took off the tarp and lit the fire and used that to cook and dry our clothes. We decided that we should take turns watching the campsite. Soon it was my turn, and during my shift I stayed in the tent with Alex, keeping watch, listening. It was then that I noticed footsteps. Something was moving closer, and I saw a light. My heart was pounding in my chest, and just as I thought it couldn't get any worse, I saw a little stream of light entering the tent as the creature cut open a tiny hole. The little hole was just like the ones that we'd covered up the night before. It was barely enough for the light to shine through, but the creature looked through it. I could still see its eyes in my head. Its pupils were large, but thin like those of a snake. It locked eyes with me, and I waited there for a long time, but nothing happened. The creature saw me. I know it did, but it did nothing. I don't know why. It never did anything more than cut a little hole in the tent. There was a snapping sound. The creature looked away and let out a loud shriek and rushed off into the night. The next day we packed up everything and drove as fast as we could out of the forest. We didn't really have time to talk about that night, and we never did. I also never told them that the creature visited us again that night. I thought everything was over, but last night I saw something as I was going to bed. There was a strange light coming from the backyard fence. The next morning I investigated the fence and I saw very small, clean cuts I didn't know what it was or what it wanted. Well, it followed me. I just hope the others are safe.